He only noticed the silence when it was too late. The words would come to haunt Duke Sebastian Blackwood long after the echoes of her footsteps had faded from the halls of Ravenhurst Manor. But on that cold winter evening, he stood alone in his study, unaware that something vital had already slipped through his fingers without a sound. The fire crackling low beside him, casting long shadows across the stone walls, his attention fixed on a stack of correspondence he barely read. While just beyond the heavy oak door, Clara Hayes moved quietly. Down the corridor, her soft steps swallowed by the vastness of the estate as they always were. She carried a tray balanced carefully in her hands, the porcelain cup steady despite the faint tremor in her fingers, though no one would ever notice such a thing. No one ever did. Not in this house where she existed as something between presence and absence, always there, yet never truly seen. She paused briefly outside the study door, listening, not for permission, but out of habit, a lifetime of, making herself smaller, quieter, easier to ignore, before stepping inside without a word, setting the tray down with practiced precision. The faint clink of china barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Sebastian did not look up, not when she entered, not when she adjusted the papers at the edge of his desk to keep them from falling, not even when her sleeve brushed lightly against his hand for the briefest second, a touch so fleeting it might have been imagined. He simply continued, reading, his expression unchanged, his mind elsewhere, as if she were nothing more than another piece of furniture arranged for his convenience. And Clara, as always, said nothing. She stepped back into the shadows where she belonged, her gaze lingering on him for just a moment longer than necessary, as though memorizing something she would not allow herself to want, before turning toward the door, her movements careful, controlled, invisible, just as they had been every day since she first arrived at Ravenhurst Manor nearly 2 years ago. In those 2 years she had learned every rhythm of the house, every unspoken rule, every quiet need that went unmet. Until she fulfilled it without acknowledgement, she knew the exact temperature he preferred his tea, knew which coat he reached for on colder mornings, knew the subtle shift in his daughter's breathing that signaled a nightmare before it even began. She knew everything. And yet, to him, she was nothing more than a silent figure passing through his world, unnoticed, unremarked upon, and perhaps, in some quiet corner of her heart, she had once hoped that might change, that one day he might look at her, truly look, and see more than the absence she had become. But hope, she had learned, was a luxury she could not afford, not here, not with a man who had built his life on distance and silence. So she let it fade, piece by piece, until all that remained was duty, and even that felt fragile now, as though it might slip away with the next breath, the next step, the next moment he chose not to see her. And still, he did not look up, not even as the door closed softly behind her, sealing the silence back into place, unchanged, unbroken, as if nothing had happened at all. The next morning arrived without announcement, just a slow gray light seeping through the tall windows of Ravenhurst Manor, touching the edges of furniture that had not moved in years and illuminating a house that appeared unchanged. Yet something within it had begun to shift, though no one could yet name what was missing. Clara Hayes moved through the corridors as she always did, her steps measured, her presence quiet. But there was a subtle difference now, something that lingered beneath the surface like a breath held too long. She carried linens folded with careful precision, pausing only when necessary, speaking only when spoken to. Though even that was rare, her world existed in the spaces between others, in the moments no one else noticed. And yet, despite her silence, everything in the manor bore the mark of her unseen care, the polished banister that never gathered dust, the fire that was always lit before the chill could settle in, the small, thoughtful adjustments that made a vast and lonely place feel almost alive. Upstairs, in a room filled with pale morning light, a young girl sat by the window, her small hands clutching a worn book she had not turned a page of in several minutes. Lady Eleanor Blackwood had learned, in her short years, the language of absence. Though she could not yet put it into words, she felt it now, a quiet unease that settled in her chest as she glanced toward the door, waiting for a presence that had not yet arrived. Clara was late, not by any measurable standard, but enough for the child to notice, enough for something to feel wrong. Downstairs, Duke Sebastian Blackwood moved through his routine with the same cold efficiency that had defined his life for years, his coat already fastened, his gloves laid neatly on the table, his mind occupied with matters far beyond the walls of his home. He did not notice the missing detail, not yet. He did not see that the ink on his desk had not been refreshed, that the letter he intended to send remained unsigned because the quill he always reached for had not been placed exactly where it should have been. These were small things, insignificant things, and yet they were the threads that held his world together, threads he had never once considered, because they had always been there, because she had always been there. When Clara finally entered the breakfast room, she did so with the same quiet grace as always, her expression composed, her movements precise. But her eyes lingered for a fraction longer than usual on the child by the window, and something softened there, something that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the fragile bond they had formed in the spaces Sebastian never saw. She crossed the room and placed a gentle hand on Eleanor's shoulder, the girl immediately leaning into the touch as though it were the only steady thing in her world. Sebastian glanced up briefly at the movement, his gaze passing over Clara without pause, acknowledging only his daughter as he spoke in a tone that was neither harsh nor warm, simply distant, asking about her lessons, her progress, her day ahead. Clara stood there for a moment longer than necessary, as if waiting for something that would not come, a word, a glance, some small recognition that she existed beyond the role she fulfilled, but none came, and after a quiet breath she stepped back once more, retreating into the background where she belonged, unseen, unheard, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to fade. The days that followed did not announce their change with noise or disruption, but with something far more unsettling, a quiet unraveling that no one could quite explain, and yet it touched everything, like a thread slowly pulled loose from a carefully woven tapestry. Clara Hayes continued her duties with the same steady rhythm, but there was a growing stillness within her, a distance that even she could not fully name, as if she were already learning how to exist without leaving a trace. She spoke less, moved lighter, her presence thinning in a way that made her almost indistinguishable from the silence itself. And though the household remained functional, something essential had begun to falter. Lady Eleanor noticed it first, in the way Clara's smile no longer lingered, in the way her hand, once warm and grounding, now felt distant, as though it belonged to someone already halfway gone. The child clung to her more often, seeking reassurance she could not articulate, but Clara only offered what she always had, gentle care without promise, kindness without expectation, while across the manor, Duke Sebastian Blackwood remained untouched by the shift, or so it seemed. He continued his routines with the same precise control, attending to matters of estate and obligation, his mind occupied with numbers, land, and letters that demanded his attention. But even in his structured world, small disruptions began to appear, subtle enough to ignore, yet persistent enough to unsettle. His coat was not where he expected it to be. His study lacked its usual order. The fire burned too low before it was replenished. These were minor inconveniences, easily corrected, and yet they created a faint irritation that lingered longer than it should, a discomfort he could not quite dismiss, though he did not question it, did not trace it back to its source, because to do so would require him to notice what he had spent years overlooking. One afternoon, as gray clouds gathered beyond the tall windows, Clara stood in the hallway outside his study once more, her hands clasped lightly before her, her posture composed, but her gaze fixed on the closed door as though it held something she had yet to understand. She had come with a simple purpose, to inform him of Eleanor's lessons, to ask for a small decision that only he could make. But as she stood there, the words felt heavier than they should, as though speaking them would bind her to a place she no longer belonged. She raised her hand to knock, then hesitated, a pause so brief it might have been missed, and in that moment, something shifted inside her, quiet but final. She lowered her hand, stepping back without a sound, turning away before the door ever opened, before he ever had the chance not to see her again. Inside the study, Sebastian turned a page in his ledger, unaware that just beyond the door, a choice had been made, one that would alter the shape of everything he had taken for granted. He did not hear her footsteps fade down the corridor, did not notice that for the first time, she had chosen not to enter his world, and the silence that followed was deeper than before, not because it was louder, but because something within it had changed, something that would not return, though he had yet to understand that he was already standing at the edge of its absence. That evening, the manor settled into its usual rhythm, but the quiet felt different, heavier somehow, as though the walls themselves were listening for something that no longer came. Clara Hayes moved through the dim corridors with a calm that bordered on detachment, her steps no longer guided by habit alone, but by a quiet decision that had already taken root deep within her. She completed each task with the same precision as always, adjusting curtains against the creeping cold, ensuring that lamps were lit before darkness could claim the rooms. But there was no longer any lingering, no extra moment spent correcting what did not need correcting, no silent watch over details that no one else would notice. It was as if she were slowly withdrawing her presence from the house piece by piece, leaving only what was required and nothing more. Upstairs, Lady Eleanor sat at the edge of her bed, her small hands folded in her lap, watching Clara with a confusion she could not hide. Children sensed what adults ignored, and she felt the distance growing, felt it in the way Clara no longer brushed her hair with the same gentle patience, felt it in the way her voice softened but did not stay, as though each word was already on its way out of the room. "Will you read to me tonight?" Eleanor asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara paused, just for a second, her fingers stilling against the fabric of the blanket she had been straightening, and in that pause lived something fragile, something that might have changed everything if it had been seen, but no one was there to see it. She turned back with a faint smile, the kind that carried warmth but no promise, and nodded, sitting beside the child as she opened the familiar book, her voice steady, calm, telling a story that seemed to echo the one unfolding around them. A tale of someone waiting to be noticed, of something slipping away unnoticed until it was gone. Downstairs, Duke Sebastian Blackwood stood by the fireplace, staring into the low-burning flames as though searching for something just beyond his reach. The room felt colder than usual, though the fire had been lit as it always was. He adjusted his cuff absent-mindedly, a small irritation settling in his chest without cause, or at least without one he could identify. Something was off, something subtle. But he dismissed it as he dismissed most things that did not fit neatly into his control. He crossed the room, reaching for the glass that should have been placed at the exact corner of his desk. But it was not there, not precisely where he expected, and for a brief moment, his hands stilled in the air, a flicker of confusion crossing his expression before it vanished just as quickly. He set the glass down himself. A simple act, insignificant, and yet it lingered in his mind. Longer than it should have. Upstairs, Clara's voice softened as the story came to an end, Eleanor's eyes growing heavy as she leaned closer, seeking the comfort that had always been there, and Clara allowed it, just this once, her hand resting lightly against the child's hair, memorizing the quiet weight of the moment, because somewhere within her, she knew it would not last. When Eleanor finally drifted to sleep, Clara remained there for a while longer, watching her, not with sorrow, but with a kind of quiet acceptance, as though she had already stepped beyond the place where hope could reach her. And when she finally rose, her movements were even quieter than before, the door closing behind her with the softest sound, leaving the room unchanged, and yet, in a way that could not yet be understood, already missing something it would never have again. Morning came with a brittle stillness that clung to Ravenhurst Manor like frost along the window panes, thin and quiet, and impossible to ignore if one only chose to look. But Duke Sebastian Blackwood did not look. Not yet. He moved through the great hall with his usual measured stride, coat perfectly fitted, expression composed, every detail of his appearance controlled and exact, yet the world around him felt subtly misaligned, as though something had shifted during the night and failed to return to its rightful place. The servants greeted him as they always did, their voices respectful, their movements precise. But even among them there was a faint hesitation, a pause too small to question and yet present enough to feel, the kind of silence that followed something missing rather than something broken. Sebastian paused at the threshold of the breakfast room, his gaze sweeping the space with quiet expectation, and for a moment, just a moment, there was something like anticipation in the way his eyes moved, as though searching for a detail he had never before acknowledged needing. The table was set. The light filtered through the tall windows. Eleanor sat where she always did, her small frame still and unusually quiet. But there was no one standing just behind her chair, no soft movement adjusting the edge of the tablecloth, no silent presence ensuring everything existed exactly as it should. Clara Hayes was not there. The realization did not strike him all at once. It arrived slowly, like a thought that refused to fully form. He took his seat, unfolding his napkin with deliberate care, his attention drawn to the smallest inconsistencies. The tea was slightly cooler than he preferred, the arrangement of utensils just a fraction out of place. Details so minor they should not have mattered, and yet they lingered, pressing faintly against his awareness in a way he could not dismiss. Eleanor glanced toward the door more than once, her eyes searching with a quiet urgency. She did not speak aloud. "Will she come?" she asked. Finally, her voice small but clear in the stillness of the room. Sebastian's hand paused mid-motion, the question hanging between them, undefined. He looked at her, truly looked for the first time that morning, and something in her expression unsettled him, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it revealed a truth he had never considered, that someone else had been essential to her world in a way he had not been. "Who?" he asked, though the answer was already there, unspoken. Eleanor lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "Miss Hayes," she said softly, and the name settled into the room with a weight that had never been given to it before. Sebastian's brow furrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in the faint irritation of a man confronted with something he could not immediately resolve. "She will attend to her duties," he replied, his tone even, dismissive in its certainty, as though the matter required no further thought. But the words felt incomplete even as he spoke them, because for the first time, there was a question beneath them, quiet and unwelcome. "Where is she?" The thought came uninvited, subtle but persistent. He pushed it aside, reaching for his tea, though the taste no longer held the same quiet satisfaction it once did, and as the morning stretched forward, the absence remained, not loud, not disruptive, but undeniable. A space where something had always been, now left empty, waiting to be noticed. By midday, the absence had settled into Ravenhurst Manor like a quiet storm that no one could see, and yet everyone could feel. It moved through the corridors in subtle disruptions, in glances exchanged between servants, in tasks completed just a little too late or not quite as precisely as before, and though no one dared speak of it aloud, there was a growing awareness that something essential had slipped out of place. Duke Sebastian Blackwood remained in his study, attempting to focus on the estate accounts spread before him, but the numbers blurred more than they should have, his attention drifting not toward anything specific, but toward a faint and persistent sense of imbalance. He reached for his pen, only to pause when it was not positioned exactly where it had always been. A trivial matter, easily corrected, yet his hand lingered in the air for a moment longer than necessary, as though expecting the world to adjust itself without his intervention. When it did not, he set the pen down with a sharper motion than intended, irritation flickering briefly across his expression, not because of the inconvenience, but because of the unfamiliar feeling beneath it, something that felt dangerously close to uncertainty. He rose from his chair, pacing once across the room before stopping at the window, his gaze fixed on the gray expanse of the grounds beyond, the landscape unchanged, the trees standing bare and still against the winter sky. And yet even there, something felt different, as though the silence outside echoed the one growing within the walls behind him. He told himself it was nothing, a passing disruption, a minor lapse in the order of the house, but the thought did not settle as easily as it should have. Instead, it lingered, quiet and insistent. "Where is she?" The question surfaced again, clearer this time, and with it came a faint recollection, not of her face, not of her voice, but of her absence in moments where she should have been. The breakfast room, the hallway, the quiet space just behind his daughter's chair. He turned from the window abruptly, as though the thought itself were unwelcome, and stepped into the corridor, his presence immediately altering the atmosphere as servants straightened, their movements quickening under his gaze. "Miss Hayes," he said, the name leaving his lips with a familiarity he had never acknowledged before. and yet it sounded foreign in the open air. No one answered at first, the silence stretching just enough to make something tighten in his chest. Then the housekeeper stepped forward, her posture respectful, her expression carefully composed. "Your Grace," she began, hesitating just slightly. "Miss Hayes is not in the house." The words were simple, factual, and yet they carried a weight far beyond their meaning. Sebastian's gaze sharpened, not in alarm, but in a controlled focus that masked the shift beneath. "Not in the house." He repeated, as though testing the truth of it, as though expecting it to correct itself. But it did not. The housekeeper lowered her eyes. "She left early this morning, Your Grace." And for a moment, time seemed to pause, not in any dramatic sense, but in the quiet way something irreversible settles into place. He said nothing, his expression unchanged, but within him, something had begun to move, slow and unfamiliar. A realization not yet fully formed, but already impossible to ignore. She had not simply stepped away, she had left, and for the first time, the absence was no longer a passing detail. It was a fact, solid and undeniable, and it was only then, standing in the corridor where she had walked 1,000 times unseen, that Duke Sebastian Blackwood began to understand that the silence he had dismissed was not empty at all. It was the shape of something that had been taken from him, and he had not even noticed when it was still there. The corridor remained still long after the words had been spoken, as though the very walls of Ravenhurst Manor were waiting for a response that did not come. Duke Sebastian Blackwood stood unmoving, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the housekeeper who had just delivered the quiet truth. She had left, not stepped away, not delayed, but gone entirely, and the finality of it did not strike him like a storm. It settled instead like a slow and spreading cold, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, yet impossible to ignore once it took hold. He turned without a word, dismissing the housekeeper with nothing more than a slight motion of his hand, and began to walk, not with purpose, but with a growing need he did not yet understand. His steps carried him through the familiar halls, past rooms that had always existed in perfect order, yet now seemed slightly altered, as though something within them had shifted out of alignment. He entered the study, pausing just inside the doorway, his eyes moving across the space with a quiet intensity. The desk was as it had always been, the chair positioned precisely, the fire burning low, and yet something was missing, not an object, not anything he could name, but a presence, something that had existed in the margins of his awareness without ever demanding his attention, and now that it was gone, the absence pressed against him in a way he could not dismiss. He crossed the room slowly, his fingers brushing against the edge of the desk where she had once adjusted the papers without being asked. A memory surfaced, faint and unwelcome, the soft sound of porcelain placed gently at his side, the quiet rustle of fabric as she moved without disturbing the air, and for the first time, he realized that those moments had not been empty. They had been filled with her, always her, unnoticed, unacknowledged, and now, unreachable. He turned sharply, leaving the study as quickly as he had entered, his steps carrying him upward, drawn by something deeper than reason. Something that pulled him toward the one place where her absence would be most clearly felt, Lady Eleanor's room. He paused at the threshold, the door slightly ajar, and through the narrow opening, he saw his daughter, sitting by the window, her small figure still, her gaze fixed on the empty space beside her, the place where Clara had always been. He pushed the door open quietly, stepping inside with a hesitation that had never before defined him. Eleanor did not turn at first, as though she already knew who stood behind her, or perhaps she was waiting for someone else entirely. "She is not coming back today, is she?" the child said softly, her voice carrying a certainty that unsettled him more than any question could have. Sebastian felt something tighten in his chest, not sharp, not sudden, but heavy, like a weight he had not prepared to carry. "She will return," he replied, though the words lacked the conviction he intended, because even as he spoke them, he knew they were not based on knowledge, but on assumption, on the belief that things remained as they had always been, that what was present would always remain so. Eleanor turned then, her eyes searching his face with a quiet intensity, as though looking for something she could trust, something solid. But whatever she sought was not there. Her gaze faltered, dropping back to her hands as she whispered. "She said goodbye." and the words fell into the room with a finality that echoed far beyond their softness. Goodbye. The meaning settled slowly, not just in his mind, but somewhere deeper, somewhere he had not allowed himself to feel in years. She had not simply left, she had chosen to go, and in that choice was something he could not control, could not undo. And for the first time, Duke Sebastian Blackwood understood that the silence surrounding him was not temporary. It was the result of something lost, something he had never valued, until it was no longer his to ignore. The word lingered long after it had been spoken, settling into every corner of Ravenhurst Manor with a quiet permanence that could not be undone. Goodbye. It was such a simple word, one he had heard countless times in passing, in routine, in moments that carried no weight, and yet now it felt different, final in a way that pressed against his thoughts with an unfamiliar force. Duke Sebastian Blackwood stood in the doorway of his daughter's room for longer than he realized, his gaze fixed on the small figure by the window, but his mind drifting elsewhere, tracing something he had never before followed. Memory. It came in fragments at first, scattered and incomplete, a glimpse of a figure moving quietly through a room, a hand adjusting the edge of a tablecloth, the faintest sound of footsteps that never demanded attention. He had never noticed how often she had been there, how consistently she had filled the spaces he ignored, and now those same spaces stood empty, stark in their absence. He turned away slowly, leaving the room without another word, the corridor stretching before him in a silence that felt deeper than it had any right to be. His steps carried him without direction, guided not by habit, but by something unsettled within him, something searching, though he did not yet know for what. He passed the study, the breakfast room, the staircase where she had once paused to allow others to pass, each place holding a faint echo of something he could not quite grasp, until he found himself standing before a door he had never opened without purpose. Clara's room. It was smaller than the others, modest in its simplicity, the kind of space meant for someone who existed within the household but not truly as part of it. He hesitated, his hand resting against the handle as though the act of opening it carried more weight than it should. Then, with a quiet motion, he stepped inside. The room was still, untouched, yet not abandoned. Everything was in its place, neatly arranged, as though she had left with the same careful precision she had lived with. The bed was made. The small table by the window held a single book, its cover worn from use, and beside it, a folded piece of fabric, a shawl perhaps, simple, unremarkable, and yet it drew his attention in a way he could not explain. He moved further into the room, his gaze shifting slowly, taking in details he had never thought to consider. This was where she had existed when she was not invisible within his world. This was where she had been when he was not looking. A faint scent lingered in the air, something soft and clean, not strong enough to name, but present enough to feel. He reached the table, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge before pausing over the book. He opened it without thinking, and inside, tucked between the pages, was a single sheet of paper, not addressed, not sealed, simply placed there as though it had never been meant to be found. He hesitated for a moment, then unfolded it slowly, the words written in careful, steady script, not hurried, not emotional, but deliberate, as though each line had been chosen with quiet certainty. He read in silence, his expression unchanged, but something within him shifted with each passing word. There was no accusation, no bitterness, only a calm acknowledgement of what had always been, that she had stayed as long as she could, that she had given what she had without expectation, and that at some point, she had understood that remaining meant disappearing entirely. The final line lingered longer than the rest, simple, almost gentle. I hope one day you will notice what you have lost. And for the first time, standing alone in a room that still held the trace of her presence, Duke Sebastian Blackwood realized that he already had, and the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of something he could not return. The paper remained in his hand long after he had finished reading it, the weight of it far greater than the thin sheet it was written on. Duke Sebastian Blackwood did not move at first, did not fold it back or set it aside. He simply stood there in the stillness of her room, as though the words themselves had anchored him in place. And for the first time in years, silence was no longer something he controlled. It surrounded him, pressed in from every direction, filled with echoes he had never allowed himself to hear. He read the final line again without looking down. The words etched into his mind with a clarity that would not fade. "I hope one day you will notice what you have lost." And something within him shifted, not sharply, not all at once, but steadily, like a door opening in a place he had long kept closed. He lowered the paper slowly, his gaze moving across the room once more, but now everything looked different, not because it had changed, but because he had. The small details he once would have dismissed now held meaning. The carefully folded shawl, the book left behind, the quiet order of a life lived without disturbance. All of it spoke in a way he had never listened to before, and the realization settled deep. She had not left in anger. She had not left in chaos. She had left with dignity, with intention, and most of all, with the certainty that she had nothing left to give to a place that had never truly seen her. His fingers tightened slightly around the paper, the first visible sign of something breaking through the composure he had worn for so long. And with it came memory, not vague impressions, but clear, undeniable moments. He saw her now, truly saw her, standing just behind him as she always had, adjusting the details of his world without ever stepping into it. He heard the quiet sound of her voice reading to his daughter in the evenings, the calm, steady tone that had filled spaces he had left empty. He remembered the way Eleanor's small hand had reached for hers without hesitation, the trust that had formed in his absence, and the thought struck him with a weight he had not prepared. For she had been there in every moment that mattered, and he had not once chosen to see it. He moved then, abruptly, as though stillness had become unbearable, crossing the room in a few measured steps before stopping again, his gaze drawn back to the table, to the place where the letter had been hidden, not meant to accuse, not meant to wound, but simply to exist as a quiet truth. He folded the paper carefully, not out of habit, but with a precision that carried something else beneath it, something that felt dangerously close to regret. And as he slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat, the action felt final in a way he could not explain, as though he were carrying something far heavier than paper outside the room. The manor continued its quiet routine, but within him, something had begun to fracture, not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that would not be contained. He stepped back into the corridor, his expression unchanged to anyone who might see him, but his steps no longer carried the same certainty. There was a hesitation now, subtle but undeniable, as though each movement required thought where once there had been none. He paused at the top of the staircase, his gaze lowering toward the hall below, and for a moment, he stood there, suspended between what had been and what now was, and the truth settled fully at last, not as a thought, but as something deeper, something that could not be ignored or undone. She was gone, not just from the house, but from the life he had never realized she had been holding together. And for the first time, Duke Sebastian Blackwood understood that what he had lost was not simply a presence. It was the quiet foundation of everything he had taken for granted, and without it, nothing would ever feel the same again. That evening, Ravenhurst Manor did not feel like a place of power. It felt like a structure barely holding itself together beneath a silence that no longer obeyed him. Duke Sebastian Blackwood stood alone in his study once more, but the room no longer responded to his presence the way it always had. There was no quiet adjustment behind him, no unseen correction of the small imperfections he had never needed to acknowledge. Everything remained exactly as he left it, and that was precisely what made it feel wrong. He moved toward his desk, his hand instinctively reaching for the familiar arrangement of objects. But now each motion required intention, thought, effort, as though he were learning to exist within his own life without the invisible guidance that had once shaped it. He poured his own drink, the sound sharper than it should have been, echoing in the stillness. And when he lifted the glass, he hesitated, not because of the act itself, but because of the memory that followed it. The countless times it had appeared beside him without request, placed there with quiet precision by someone he had never acknowledged. He set it down without drinking, the weight in his chest deepening, not sudden, not overwhelming, but constant, unavoidable, and for the first time, it began to take shape as something he could not dismiss, regret, not for a single moment, but for the absence of all the moments he had allowed to pass unnoticed. Upstairs, Eleanor sat awake long past the hour. She would normally be asleep, Her small figure curled near the window, watching the darkness outside as though expecting it to return something it had taken. The book Clara had left behind rested in her lap, unopened, her fingers tracing the worn edges without purpose. She did not cry, not yet, but the quiet in her room felt heavier, pressing against her in a way that made sleep impossible. Sebastian found himself drawn there again. Though he did not question why, he paused at the door, listening, not for sound, but for the absence of it. And when he stepped inside, Eleanor did not turn, did not move, as though she had already accepted that what she waited for would not come. "You should be asleep," he said, his voice measured, controlled, but softer than it had been before. She shook her head slightly, her gaze never leaving the window. "She used to stay until I fell asleep," she replied, her voice quiet but steady, not accusing, not pleading, simply stating a truth he had never known. Sebastian felt the words settle into him, not as information, but as something deeper, something that revealed a part of his daughter's life he had never entered. He moved closer, stopping a few feet away, uncertain in a way that did not belong to him. "You will sleep," he said. Though the certainty behind the words had faded, Eleanor turned then, her eyes searching his face, and for the first time, he saw something there that unsettled him more than any absence: disappointment. Not loud, not dramatic, but quiet, steady, as though she had already adjusted to a reality where what she needed would not be given. "She always knew when I was afraid," Eleanor said softly, and the words lingered, not demanding a response, but revealing a truth that required one. Sebastian said nothing, because there was nothing he could say that would change what had already been lost. He could not claim what he had not given, could not replace what he had never noticed. And as the silence settled between them, heavier than before, he understood something with a clarity that could not be undone. This was not just about her absence. It was about everything she had been, everything she had done without recognition, everything he had allowed himself to ignore. And now, standing in a room that felt colder than any winter outside, he realized that the life he had believed was complete had been quietly sustained by someone he had never chosen to see. And without her, he was left with something unfamiliar, something that would not leave him in peace, the undeniable truth that he had lost something irreplaceable, and for the first time, he did not know how to fix it. The night stretched long and unyielding, and for the first time in years, Duke Sebastian Blackwood did not retreat into the comfort of routine or silence. Instead, he remained awake, moving through Ravenhurst Manor as though it were no longer his own, each room carrying a presence that could not be seen yet refused to be ignored. He passed through the study again, slower this time, his gaze lingering on the smallest details: the uneven stack of papers, the ink bottle left uncapped, the chair slightly misaligned. Things he would have once corrected without thought, or more truthfully, things that had always been corrected before he ever noticed them. He did not fix them now. He simply stood there, aware of their imperfection, aware that the order he had believed to be inherent had never belonged to him at all. It had been given, quietly, consistently, by someone who had never asked to be seen. He moved on, his steps carrying him toward the corridor where she had often passed, and though the space was empty, his mind filled it without permission. He saw her there, not as a shadow, but as she had truly been, steady, present, her hands occupied with the small tasks that shaped his world, and the realization settled deeper. She had not simply existed around him. She had supported everything, every seamless moment, every effortless day. All of it had rested on her unseen care, and he had never once questioned it, never once considered what would remain if it were taken away. He reached the staircase and paused, his hand resting lightly against the banister, and for a brief moment, memory overtook him with a clarity that left no room for denial. He remembered her standing there once, stepping aside to let him pass, her gaze lowered, her presence reduced to nothing more than space he moved through without acknowledgement. And now, standing in the same place, he felt the absence of that moment as though it had weight, as though something essential had been removed from the very air. He exhaled slowly, the sound unfamiliar in the stillness, and continued upward, drawn once more to Eleanor's room. But this time he did not enter immediately. He stood outside the door, listening, not for sound, but for reassurance, for something to tell him that what had been lost could somehow be restored, but there was nothing, only the quiet, steady absence that had replaced what once filled the space. He opened the door slowly, stepping inside with a hesitation that no longer felt foreign. Eleanor was asleep now. Though her rest was not peaceful, her small hand still clutching the edge of the blanket, as though holding on to something that was no longer there. He approached carefully, stopping beside the bed, his gaze fixed on her, and for the first time, he truly saw her not as an extension of duty, but as someone who had depended on what he had failed to give. And the realization carried with it something heavier than regret. It carried responsibility, not for what had been, but for what he had allowed to remain unspoken, unseen, untouched. He reached out slowly, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders in a motion that felt unfamiliar, almost uncertain, and when he stepped back, the room did not settle the way it once would have, because the quiet comfort that had once followed such moments had never come from him. It had come from her, always her, and now, standing in the space she had left behind, he understood that what he faced was not simply loss. It was the undeniable truth that he had never been the one holding anything together, and without her, everything he thought was stable had begun to fall into a silence he could no longer control. Morning did not bring clarity. It only made the absence sharper, more defined, as though daylight had stripped away any illusion that this was temporary. Duke Sebastian Blackwood stood at the window of his study, the pale light stretching across the grounds, cold and distant, and for the first time, he did not see his estate as something he controlled. He saw it as something vast and empty, a place that had once been quietly held together by someone who had never claimed it as her own. His hand moved to his coat without thinking, fingers brushing against the folded paper tucked inside, and the memory of her words returned with a clarity that left no room for escape. Not accusation, not anger, only truth, steady and undeniable. He closed his eyes briefly, not in avoidance, but in acknowledgement, and when he opened them again, something within him had shifted, not resolved, not healed, but decided. He turned from the window with a purpose that felt unfamiliar, not driven by duty or expectation, but by something far more uncertain and far more necessary. He stepped into the corridor, his presence once again altering the space around him. But this time, it did not restore order. It only revealed how much had already been lost. "Prepare a carriage," he said to the first servant he encountered, his voice calm, measured, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. The servant hesitated for only a fraction of a second, surprised by the immediacy of the command, before bowing and moving quickly to obey. Sebastian did not wait, his steps carrying him toward the main hall, each movement deliberate, though beneath it lay something far less controlled, something that bordered on urgency. He paused only once, at the foot of the staircase, his gaze lifting briefly toward the upper floor, toward the room where Eleanor still slept. And for a moment, something held him there, not doubt, not hesitation, but the recognition of what he was leaving behind and why he could not remain. He turned away without another thought, because staying meant accepting what had already been lost, and he was not yet willing to do that. Outside, the cold air met him with a sharp clarity, the kind that did not allow for hesitation. The carriage stood ready within minutes, the horses shifting restlessly as though sensing the urgency that had taken hold of their master. Sebastian stepped forward, then stopped, his gaze lowering to the gravel path beneath his feet, and in that stillness, a single realization surfaced with quiet certainty. He did not know where she had gone, not truly. He had never asked, never cared to know the details of a life that had existed so closely to his own, and now, that absence of knowledge stood before him like a barrier he could not simply command to move. His hand tightened briefly at his side, not in frustration, but in the recognition of what he had allowed to remain unknown. And yet, he did not step back. He did not turn away, because even without direction, the choice had already been made. He would not remain in a place that echoed with her absence, not when there was still a chance, however small, that the distance between them had not yet become permanent. He stepped into the carriage, the door closing behind him with a final sound that carried more weight than any command he had ever given. And as the wheels began to move, carrying him away from the only life he had ever known, Duke Sebastian Blackwood understood something with a clarity that would not leave him. He was not riding out as a man in control. He was leaving as someone who had finally realized he had something to lose. And for the first time, he was willing to follow that loss into the unknown, because remaining meant accepting silence, and he was no longer certain he could endure it. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a pale ribbon cutting through the winter landscape, and for the first time in his life, Duke Sebastian Blackwood did not know where it would lead him. The carriage moved steadily, the rhythmic sound of wheels against frozen ground echoing through the quiet. But his mind was far from the journey itself. It remained behind, in the corridors of Ravenhurst Manor, in the spaces she had once filled without effort. Without recognition, he leaned back slightly, his gaze unfocused as memory continued its relentless return, no longer fragmented, no longer distant, but whole, undeniable. He saw her clearly now, not as a shadow passing through his world, but as the quiet center of it, the one who had softened every edge he had allowed to remain sharp, the one who had brought warmth to a place he had long abandoned to cold routine. And the realization did not bring him comfort. It brought him clarity, and with it, something heavier than regret, responsibility. He reached into his coat once more, unfolding the paper with careful precision, reading the words again, not because he needed to, but because they had become something more than a message. They were a truth he could no longer escape. She had not left to be found. She had left because she believed she was already lost to him. And that was something he could not simply undo with distance or command. The carriage slowed briefly. As it passed through a small village, the faint signs of life breaking through the stillness, and he found himself looking out at the unfamiliar surroundings with a quiet intensity, searching not for her specifically, but for any trace of the path she might have taken, any indication of where she had gone when she chose to leave everything behind. But the world beyond his estate was vast, indifferent, and for the first time, he felt the weight of not knowing, of not having asked the simplest questions when there had still been time. The carriage came to a halt, the driver turning slightly to await instruction. But Sebastian did not speak immediately. He remained still, his gaze fixed ahead, as though expecting the answer to reveal itself if he simply waited long enough. But it did not, because this was not a matter of control, it was a matter of understanding. And that was something he had never allowed himself to learn. He stepped down from the carriage slowly, the cold air, sharper here, unfamiliar, grounding in a way that forced him to remain present. He looked around, taking in the small details of a place he had never considered before, the worn paths, the distant figures moving through their own lives, lives that existed without his influence, without his awareness, and somewhere within that vastness, she was there, no longer part of his world, but part of her own. And that thought settled into him with a quiet finality. He could not simply take her back into the life she had left behind, because she had not left to be retrieved. She had left to exist beyond what he had allowed her to be. And yet, he did not turn away. He did not return to the carriage or the safety of what he had always known, because something within him had already changed, something that would not allow him to return unchanged. He stepped forward, not with certainty, but with intention, each step carrying him further into a world he had never needed to understand before. And for the first time, he did not expect it to bend to him. He accepted that he would have to follow it instead, to learn, to search, to see what he had once ignored, because what he had lost was not simply her presence, it was the chance to become someone who could recognize it. And as he moved forward into the unknown, the silence that followed him was no longer empty. It carried something else now, something fragile, uncertain, but undeniably real. The beginning of a man who had finally learned that some hearts only begin to feel when they are forced to face what they were never meant to lose.